what I've been asked to do is give an overview of some current work that's going on with dinosaurs. A lot of you obviously will know a lot about dinosaurs already, but many of you may not be aware of some of the very recent work that's been going ahead on these kinds of animals. So we've known a lot about dinosaurs for a long time. First discovered in southern England in the 1820s, they've remained subsequently found all over the world, and we've gone through many different phases in our understanding. Initially interpreted as giant, elephantine or rhinoceros-like lizards, going through various stages of sorts of reptiles, creeping large behemoths that were basically viewed as animals that were evolutionary dead ends, going all the way through our modern perception of dinosaurs, such as from this picture here, where we see them as quite dynamic animals, actually quite complex in their behaviour, and actually pushing the limits of what it really means to be a terrestrial animal. These things range in size from very small, the size of a small bird, all the way up to things that are about 70 tons in weight, really pushing the limits of what it takes to engineer an animal that can live on land. Very successful as a group, around for an exceptionally long time, and the majority of vertebrate paleontologists would now also concur that these animals are the direct evolutionary ancestors of birds, and actually that birds should really be considered as a subset of dinosaur diversity, in fact the only living dinosaurs, differing from a lot of the small meat-eating dinosaurs that are around 150 million years ago in only a few relatively subtle ways. But anyway, what I'm going to do tonight is I'm not going to try and give a huge talk that deals with every single aspect of dinosaur biology, but a few snapshots dealing with particular things that I've been involved with, and also some things that have actually been current controversies in the area, or where there's been some exciting new results. So more of an update of our global picture of dinosaurs rather than giving you a comprehensive view of the state of the subject at the moment. So dinosaurs first appear on Earth about 240 million years ago. And this is work that's been done very recently. This goes back into a period of the Earth's history known as the Middle Triassic, or potentially the very early part of the Late Triassic. And at this time in Earth history, all of the continents are joined together in a single landmass called Pangaea. Climates are rather different from how they are now. Vast deserts covering lots of the central part of Pangaea, monsoonal climates, all sorts of interesting things going on in terms of the paleo environments, and also the other animals and plants that are around, most of which would be very unfamiliar to us today. This is a time when most of the living groups of animals we're familiar with, mammals, amphibians, lizards and so on, still aren't on the stage. They're kind of probably just starting to appear on the cladograms, but they're really not doing anything very important. So if you were transported back 240 million years, what you would find instead is a wide variety of mammal ancestors, things called the synapsids, things like dicynodonts, a number of other animals that are the dominant herbivores, a number of weird-looking reptiles that have no living counterparts today that have gone completely extinct, and for Diane's benefits, the flora would also look rather different. No flowering plants, the dominant plants being things like ferns, cycadophytes, various sorts of conifer. So a very different-looking world. And it's this world that dinosaurs first appear in. And initially, they're incredibly unimportant. A very small, minor component of these faunas. In fact, we only have 2 specimens of Middle Triassic dinosaurs from many thousands of different skeletons of other sorts of animals that have been collected from rocks of that age. And those 2 skeletons suggest that these very early dinosaurs are small animals, probably no more than a couple of meters long, and of that couple of meters, about half of that would be a very long, skinny tail. These animals would have been probably omnivorous or maybe carnivorous, and running around the feet of some actually rather big, nasty early ancestors of mammals that would have been the dominant predators and herbivores at the time. So dinosaurs come in with a whimper. There are very few of them. And it's only a little bit later in their evolutionary history, about 20-25 million years later, that they start to take over as the dominant animals on Earth. And that doesn't seem to be because it's an intrinsic property of dinosaur brilliance, it's because of an extinction event. An extinction event at the end of the Triassic period which wipes out all of these other groups and creates ecological space for dinosaurs to really get going. So the beginning of dinosaur history actually starts in a very slow, quiet way, starts to take off, and then really only gets going in a big way once the stage has been cleared of other players. That's not to say that dinosaurs weren't doing anything useful or interesting. They were around for about 140 million years. So they were doing something right, and they diversified into a wide variety of types. And this goes all the way through the Mesozoic era. So going through to 66 million years ago, when whatever happened that killed the dinosaurs, apart from birds, actually came along and smashed into the Earth. A lot of people think this is a meteorite. There's excellent evidence for an asteroid impact at this time. The evidence for that grows all the time. And in fact, it's probably the consensus view among my other colleagues and also among geophysicists, people who actually go out and look at this kind of data. There's also other things going on, massive volcanism in what's now central India, general long-term changes to the climate caused by the fragmentation of the continents and changes in the climatic patterns across the world in general. But dinosaurs went through a lot of this before. They actually survived through a mass extinction, the end Triassic one. They survived through a number of minor extinctions that occur between then and the mass extinction that marks their end at the end of the Cretaceous period. During that time, they diversified into about 1,000 different species. And they're only the ones we know about at the moment. At the moment, people are discovering something like 50 to 60 new dinosaur species per year around the world. So it's actually quite difficult to keep up with the names. You generally have to be an 8 to 10-year-old child to be completely on top of what's going on in the world of dinosaurs to keep up with this. So they diversify into a lot of types. We have herbivores, carnivores, omnivores, animals that are bipedal, ranging through 2 or 3 orders of magnitude of body size and weight, and living in every part of the world, from the north slope of Alaska and Spitsbergen all the way down to the Antarctic Peninsula and central transantarctic mountains. So an incredibly diverse group, and around for a very long time. Now, what are some of the reasons for this diversity? Why were dinosaurs so successful, and what were the sorts of things they were doing? This is a bog standard, very early dinosaur. A thing called Lesothosaurus, named very imaginatively after the country of Lesotho, from where it was found. And this is a very early plant-eating dinosaur, about 200 million years old. And it gives us a general idea of what those early dinosaurs would have looked like. Early dinosaurs were bipedal. They had long hind legs that were adapted for reasonably fast running, short arms with grasping hands, those grasping hands for manipulating plants or prey. They also had relatively long tails, relatively long necks, and most of them are built on this very basic bow plan. And then from there, they start to stretch it in a number of different directions, resulting in things like gigantic carnivores like Tyrannosaurus rex, the huge long-necked sauropods, things like Diplodocus you'll find staring at you if you come and visit Natural History Museum, and also into the weird variety of horned and armoured dinosaurs that we've become very familiar with, both from museums and also from their constant portrayal as convenient B-list movie monsters over the last 50 years or so. And one of the things my researchers group has been looking at for the last few years has been looking at locomotion in dinosaurs, and in particular some of the weird things that dinosaurs do in comparison with other animals. Now, bipedality itself is weird. You are all, without wishing to cast any aspersions, you're all weird. You're all bipeds. Bipedality is actually very rare in the animal kingdom. We only have it in birds, which are dinosaur descendants. We only have it in primates. 1 or 2 other very rare examples, things like kangaroos, although they hop rather than walking in a way that we would generally recognise, and 1 or 2 lizards that will facultatively nip up on their legs and run around. And my favourite example, pangolins. Can never get pangolins into enough talks as far as I'm concerned. Pangolins are excellent. They have a fossil record, I definitely work on them, but they only have a couple, unfortunately. But anyway, so bipedality is rare. Now, dinosaurs do something really weird. A lot of dinosaurs remain bipedal. The boring dinosaurs, the meat-eating dinosaurs, generally remain bipedal throughout their evolutionary history. Almost no exceptions, if any, controversial exceptions. Whereas the plant-eating dinosaurs do something really weird. They've gone through this evolutionary struggle, if you like, bottleneck, of becoming bipedal from a quadrupedal ancestor. And then, for some reason, quite a lot of them go back down onto all fours. So they go through a bipedal stage, and then they go back down onto all fours. And as far as I can tell, I'd be very pleased to hear if anyone knows of any other examples. Dinosaurs are the only animals that become bipedal to become secondarily quadrupedal again. And it happens not once, but 4 times within dinosaurs. So there's something really weird going on within dinosaurs in terms of why they're playing with their locomotion in this way. So we've been trying to get a start to look at this question. Why, or how, rather, do you turn a bipedal animal back into a quadruped? So we've been looking at that with trying to get some idea into what the selective force is. Why on earth do you want to do that, given that you've already gone to the effort of becoming a biped, which in itself is pretty weird. So This comes down initially to some old-fashioned comparative anatomy. And although we now do a lot of things with computers and CT scanning and all the rest of it, which I will talk about in a moment, at the heart of what we do is actually looking at bones. Looking at bones, working out how bones fit together, looking at living animals that are closely related to the animals we're interested in, dissecting them, looking at their muscles, looking at them in the field to see how they'll behave. All sorts of traditional zoology, comparative anatomy, goes in as a basic data into this kind of work. And this is just to give an example of that kind of thing. These are illustrations of dinosaur hip bones, dinosaur leg bones, and the coloured patches you can see are where we've reconstructed the various muscles associated with dinosaur hips and legs, the major muscles that are involved in actually moving them around. And we can do that because we find scars that muscles leave behind on those bones, we can reconstruct how large they are, and then we can get some idea about the relative importance of those muscles and how they contribute to walking. So this is where the kind of technology then starts to take over nowadays. Previously, we would use this in a very qualitative way, we'd sit there, we'd think about how these things went together in 3D and try to come up with something sensible. But now, thanks to our colleagues who work on biomechanics of living animals, we have a number of computer-based simulation techniques where we can actually give some life to those animals and try and make them do things. So this is a little movie from a software program called GateSim, which was developed by a number of my colleagues at the University of Manchester, to actually look at the biomechanics of living animals. And what you're looking at is the hip and the leg and the lower leg of this Lasutosaurus specimen, one of our ones from the museum. And all of the red lines you can see are the reconstructed lines of action of the major muscles that operate the lower limb. So this is the hind limb of this animal. And hopefully, technical problem of the day 2 won't occur, and hopefully something will happen. There we go. So we can actually model in 3 dimensions what those muscles are doing. We can play with those muscles, we can change their properties, we can change their areas, we can change how much they pull and the order they pull in, and we can do sensitivity analyses on what that might mean for how these things would work. So this is a basic model for trying to work out how this Lasutosaurus 200 million years ago may have actually moved its thigh backwards and forwards, what the relative contributions of those muscles were to that movement, and what the muscles did, very importantly. Was the muscle involved in pulling the femur forwards? Did it pull it backwards? Did it help it stop rotating out to the side and help stabilise it? Did it stop the femur from twisting at the top? When we have that basic data on this dinosaur and on a number of quadrupedal dinosaurs, so this is a biped, we can then compare how the structure and function between those change. And what we've found by doing this work and by modelling a number of quadrupedal dinosaurs as well, is actually there are some major differences, not particularly in the anatomy of these animals, but subtle differences in the anatomy which have major consequences for how they build the muscles around those bones and how they then function. So we actually see in each group of quadrupedal dinosaurs, by doing work like this, very minor differences in bony anatomy often translate to big differences in muscular anatomy, which lead to actually completely different ways of being a quadruped. So these many different reversions to quadrupedality we see in dinosaurs, they haven't all happened the same way. They've all actually happened in different ways in the different groups of dinosaurs that have done it, which is something that was a nice new finding that we didn't really think we were going to get out of it. We thought they were all going to be the same. So it's actually quite interesting for us when it turned out that they were different. So that brings the question of why. Why, if you do have these differences and that you build these dinosaurs differently and we can see how those muscle attachments change through evolutionary time, why do we do it? And there are basically 3 ideas. The first idea is that going down onto all fours is a response to being big. And that kind of makes sense intuitively. Big animals require more support. But it doesn't make sense when we actually think about the biology of the animals. They actually scale their limb bones. Their limb bones get bigger too. And the way that their limb bones increase in size and eccentricity and shape actually means that you can still get big and not have to go down onto all fours. So we don't actually think being big is a driving force to bring these animals down onto all fours. Moreover, most of the transitions to being on all fours actually happen at quite small body sizes. So large body size is probably not a part of this equation. But there are 2 or 3 other ideas out there in the literature, all of which sound quite odd at first sight. One of those ideas is actually that a number of dinosaurs are armoured, and maybe the extra weight of the armour causes these animals to go down. If you imagine kind of a weighted pendulum, kind of a bridge, if you like, and you start putting weights onto one end of it and the pivots at the far end, You can imagine it might make that pivot fall over. So maybe if we front load the animal with lots of armour, it actually needs to go on all four to deal with that. So we actually made some imaginary animals. We took some real armoured dinosaurs, and real armoured dinosaurs that we peeled the armour off, and then other sorts of dinosaurs that we stuck armour on. And we ran computer models using these kinds of models to see what happened to the centre of gravity when we did that, and if the centre of gravity moved in such a way that it would actually require those animals to do. And what we found was if we take all the armour off or put all the armour on, it makes absolutely no difference to what a dinosaur's doing. So we're very pleased to put a big cross through that particular hypothesis. Another one that does have more credence, though, is actually another even weirder sounding one, which is in the horned dinosaurs, things like Triceratops. These animals actually have massive heads. And when I say a massive head, I'm talking about a head that's about a quarter of the total body length of the animal. So these are big, sturdy animals. And we did actually find that one reason that those particular animals might be quadrupedal is that actually if you give them a big head, they have to go down on all fours because their centre of gravity actually moves in front of their hips by quite a long way. So the evolution of large heads in horned dinosaurs, which was probably primarily driven by behavioural reasons to show off with all these frills and horns, might have actually had a secondary consequence in making them walk on all fours, which is kind of rather weird to think about. But it doesn't seem just to be due to size. So there are various other things we want to test with this, but a couple of interesting ways of getting into this that we can use using this kind of new modelling methods. So dinosaurs have a lot of weird features. Nothing like a sauropod lives today. We don't have anything around that looks basically like an elephant with a gigantic anaconda threaded through the middle of it. None of these animals were facing, or rather all of them were facing the same problems that animals face today in terms of gravity, in terms of the various physical and chemical laws that govern how things work. And there are a number of things about these animals we just have no idea at the moment what's going on. We can eliminate some possibilities, but generally as we eliminate them, we don't necessarily come up with anything better to explain some of the things that we do see going on with these. But some aspects of dinosaur biology we can get actually rather good look at now, using some of the new techniques that have only become available very easily in the last 5 to 10 years. So for example, there have been lots of advances recently in looking at dinosaur feeding behaviour. Previously, when I did my PhD on this kind of subject, it was looking at jaws, it was looking at teeth, it was thinking about how bones would work in 3 dimensions, but relatively unsophisticated, qualitative, trying to get an idea of how jaws might work. Maybe for some of my more quantitatively minded colleagues, they would use things like beam theory, the kind of things that engineers use to build bridges and so on, to look at the forces acting on skulls. But these days, with the advent of things like CT scanning, which first became widely available by the grace of hospitals giving up their spare scan time when they weren't scanning patients overnight, but more recently by more people actually getting dedicated CT scanners for doing this kind of work, you can CT scan a dinosaur skull, create a virtual model from that CT scan, and then import it into engineering software, and actually see how that skull responds to a variety of feeding-related stresses depending on what you do to it. So this is an Allosaurus skull, which was worked on by a colleague of mine in Bristol, Emily Rayfield. And Emily built this model of an Allosaurus skull. This was one of the earliest models built. This model took her effectively 3 years to build. And she then imported it into this software, made it bite different forces, different things, different parts of the jaw, and was able to look at the mechanical behaviour of that skull, how the different bones behaved, how they moved relative to each other, the forces going through those bones, and actually work out a lot about the feeding of this animal that was previously completely inaccessible, simply because we're actually able to simulate what's going on as we would do in a living animal. And this kind of work is also validated by the work that people do on living animals. So we do know that we're not just making things up. This isn't just an elegant thought experiment. We know that living animal material responds in the same kind of way. So we can be fairly certain that when we draw conclusions from this kind of work, that there is at least some kind of underlying truth to it, at least if our colleagues who work on biomechanics are finding underlying truth in their models as well. So this has now started being applied to a number of dinosaurs. This is work by a PhD student of mine. And just to give an idea of how this subject is developing, as I said, when Emily first did this for her PhD a number of years ago, it took her 3 years to build a working model. It now takes only a few months. Some people who are very gifted with this can do it much, much quicker. So this is a area of the subject that's developing, not only with feeding, it's used very widely in locomotion also, to think about the forces acting through limbs while an animal is walking or running, and also just in terms in general, if there is a question to do with force application to a bone, you can use this technique, finite engineering analysis, to come up with quantitative, testable predictions of what you might see. So, in addition to thinking about the actual mechanics of an animal, there are also things to do with its behaviour. Some of those things we can actually infer directly from the fossils, and we can find, for example, we know, for example, things like ceratopsians, these horned dinosaurs, some of them lived in groups, and we know that because we find herds of them preserved together, which indicates that they were living together at the same time. But there are many other aspects of their behaviour that are quite obtuse. We simply can't go out and watch them. We can make inferences from what crocodiles do, what birds do, but we won't necessarily know. But there are a number of surprising areas where we can actually get a very good handle on what these different animals are doing, again, because we now have some better ways of measuring these things, and also of looking more closely at things that previously were very difficult to look at. Now, the rather unprepossessing lump you can see on the screen is actually a dinosaur brain case, the part of the skull that contains the brain, also the roots of the major nerves, a number of veins and so on, the roots of the spinal cord. And this is actually a brain case of an animal called a Palaeosaurus, which for those of you of a certain age might know better as Brontosaurus. So this is an animal that's quite common, a big sauropod dinosaur, very similar to Diplodocus. And what we were interested in here, this is a newer Palaeosaurus skull, one that has a number of parts of the anatomy that are actually missing from most of the other ones that have been found previously. And one of the things we're interested in doing is gaining some insight into the biology of a Palaeosaurus, in particular its sensory world, which rather bizarrely we can do for a few senses. Touch we can't do very much about, but smell, or taste for that matter, but smell and hearing and vision we can do something about, and the reason for that is because the efficiency of those processes, the ranges that they have, are actually related to bony features of the skull. In the terms of hearing, in terms of morphology of the inner ear, in terms of smell, in terms of the size of the part of the brain dedicated to the olfactory region, and similarly in terms of vision, and also from measurements of things like the orbits. So just to give you an idea, this is that same brain case, again, hopefully not for technical hitch 2. Here we go. So this is a CT scan of this brain case, which is in a museum in the US. And what we're able to do with this is fill in the spaces within that brain case, which in the real specimen is actually filled with sediment, but we can excavate it virtually from the CT scans because the sediment looks different from the bone. And when we do that, we get a very accurate representation of what the brain of this 145 million year old dinosaur actually looked like. The various labels you can see there are referring to various structures of the brain and the nerve cords that are coming out. For those of you that are vertebrate anatomists, you'll probably recognise most of those referring to the cranial nerves, the major nerves that innervate the rest of the body. They're also very important in movements of the eye, smell, and hearing and so on. The very odd, large lump at the bottom here, if I turn it off, down here, it's come back again. So, near to the bottom of that brain endocast, as it's called, you'll see there's this big kind of odd lump down here. That's actually the pituitary gland of this animal. And you'll notice it's pretty big in comparison with the rest of the skull. But if you have to grow to an adult body size of about 30 tons in 10 or 12 years, it's just as well that you produce a lot of growth hormone. So these things are probably doing it in that way. The other thing that's rather nice from this particular scan, if you don't get dizzy by watching it spin again, is when you look at this red area up here, that's actually the inner ear. You can see the 3 semicircular canals in reasonable detail, and this kind of long bit that's pointing down here is the lagina, the part that houses the organ of hearing. And actually we can get a lot of information on head posture, the sorts of head movements this animal would be able to make, things like smell from looking at the size of the olfactory lobe. So these are really brilliant sources of information. We used to be able to do this with latex. In the old days we would make a latex cast of the inside of a dinosaur skull, but actually we don't like doing that very much. Museum curators in general don't like you pouring latex in their dinosaur heads. They can be quite difficult to get out. Otherwise you're looking for broken specimens. Similarly, it's generally frowned upon to take a beautiful complete skull and drop it on a table so that you can look inside it. Some of my colleagues historically have done this, but generally had been banned from institutions shortly thereafter. So by doing this kind of virtual modelling, which these days is very easy to do, it's much less time consuming than it used to be, particularly if, like me, you actually get PhD students or postdocs to do it for you. It becomes very fast in those respects. But this kind of stuff really gives us brilliant insights into what the soft anatomy of these animals can look like. Similarly, staying on this theme of hearing, this is a dinosaur, a very derived one. It's an owl, a barn owl. And this is part of a project we had to try and get some insights into dinosaur hearing, looking to see if we could use the dimensions of the ears to actually tell us something about hearing in extinct animals. Because the ears are bony capsules or cartilaginous capsules, they actually preserve as fossils. So we were interested in knowing if any measurements of those could actually give us direct insights into hearing. And what we found, we went out, CT scanned about 50 or 60 living birds, living reptiles, did lots of measurements of ears, and what we found was actually you can. Physiologists might want to stick an electrode in this, and actually that is the best way of getting to know how well an animal can hear. But equally, some very simple measurements of things like Regina actually do quite well in predicting the range of hearing that animals might actually experience, and also the preferred frequency of hearing. There are actually quite strong correlations between some very simple measurements that you can make of the inner ear and the sorts of behaviour and environments and the sorts of soundings animals heard. So using this type of technique, we've only used it so far on extinct birds, because most of our data set was actually living birds. But we're actually able to make quite nice predictions about what Archaeopteryx, the earliest bird, may have been able to hear. And it turns out it had a hearing range very similar to that of an emu, a living emu. So quite deep sounds. So Archaeopteryx wouldn't have been making nice sweet tweeting noises as it flitted around the Solnhofen Lagoon looking for dragonflies. Instead, it would have almost certainly been making rather unpleasant low croaking noises. So these kinds of things do give us some insight into how they hear. By inference, animals only listen to things that they can, the sounds that they are making or their mates are making. So if we know roughly what their range of hearing is, it gives us some bounds on the actual noises these animals themselves were making. So we move from these kinds of things where we can actually make potentially quantitative predictions about these to some things that are more discovery-led. In particular, thinking about some specific aspects of behaviour. So as I've already mentioned, we know a number of dinosaurs lived in herds. And we know this because we find their bones in huge herds that fossilised in instantaneous events, usually caused by flash floods, mudslides and so on, that trap the remains of a single group in one place at one time. This has been known for quite some time. It's not really a major finding. But when we start to look at this in more detail, we can actually say some more specific things about it. This is a very beautiful fossil of a little dinosaur called Psittacosaurus, which is known from a wide area of China, Japan, Mongolia. It's an East Asian animal about 125 million years old. It's probably the most abundant dinosaur that we know about at the moment. Literally hundreds of skeletons of this animal are known. It's pretty small. It's a plant eater. It's bipedal. It's only about 1.5 meters in length tops. So very small, very cute, would make a very good pet. Vegetarian, you could probably have it outside instead of a sheep or something, keep your grass short. And quite cute. And we also have growth series of these animals, all the way from inside the egg, all the way up to fully grown adults of about 1.5 meters in size. Now this rather beautiful fossil here is actually 6 Psittacosaurus specimens preserved together, and we're fairly sure this is evidence of what we like to call an intergenerational herd. These are 6 individuals that fall into 2 distinct size classes. Several of those animals we estimate to be about 1.5 years old. The others we estimate to be about 3 years old. And the reason we did that initially was on the basis of size. Because this is such a common dinosaur, there are all sorts of growth studies on Psittacosaurus, quite good models of growth in these, and we're able to use those models to predict what was going on here. And then this was ground truthed a bit later by one of my Chinese collaborators actually going to these and doing something that I didn't think they'd ever want to do, which was taking sections of each of the thigh bones out of the block and looking at the bone structure to try and get an age, a direct age for these things. And I'm glad to say that luckily, after having done that, they found out that we were right on the basis of not having needed to saw them up in the first place. But these animals were trapped in a volcanic mudflow, something called a lahar. which is an instantaneous event, literally an instantaneous event. They're all facing the same way, which leads us to believe they're either all trying to get away from the lahar or they're all hunkered down in the same direction, trying to ignore the very hot volcanic ash that's about to kill them and entomb them for all time. And we do have these two distinct age classes. So what it looks like is we have not animals that are necessarily related together, but animals potentially from two, well, they might be related, but maybe from two different clutches that have stuck together in a herd long term, or it could be animals that have grouped together in the same way that, say, East African bovids do today for some sort of group defence. So very cute fossil. It's only about this big, that block. These animals are quite small. Most people think dinosaurs are big, but unfortunately most of the ones I work on are big. But the smaller ones actually do get down to sort of magpie size. So we also know quite a bit about dinosaur parenting and reproduction. This is work that's been done by people in particular like Jack Horner in Montana, who's done a lot of work on dinosaur nesting sites. We have many dinosaur nesting sites from around the world now, particularly well known from Patagonia, from the US, and also from China and Mongolia. They all tell us basically the same story. More recent finds that have been examined in more detail suggest that these things even lay their eggs in a bird-like way. It looks like they have a very bird-like reproductive system in general, the way that eggs are laid in the nest, the number of eggs that you get per clutch. People have even made predictions about the soft reproductive anatomy of dinosaurs based on things like the arrangement of eggs and how they're paired in the nests. Or not paired. We can also use advances in bone histology to look at this kind of thing. So this is a section through a dinosaur bone. Dinosaur bone was in general very rapid growing. This is an area that's been, in this particular slide, it's been very heavily remodeled. This is an animal that's been very actively growing, sending a very mammal-like Haversian system through its bone. Some of you might remember there was a lot of debate over dinosaur warm-bloodedness or cold-bloodedness. One of the bits of evidence was they had this very mammal-like, fast-growing bone, and it was suggested that they could only ever produce this if they were warm-blooded animals. And it does seem likely that dinosaurs did have a physiology that was different from that of living reptiles. Equally, most people who work on this question would also suggest it's also somewhat different from that of living mammals. Sort of a third different class of how to grow quickly while not necessarily being an endotherm in a strict sense. So dinosaurs doing weird things in parts of their growth biology, very fast-growing animals, and actually that's a feature that marks out dinosaurs among all other reptiles. Even their closest relatives among other reptiles grow much, much slower than dinosaurs. Right at the base of dinosaur evolutionary history, some switch goes on and they grow much quicker than any of their relatives. So again, we know that they do this, but we have no idea what the spark for that was. Why should dinosaurs become such fast-growing animals? And it used to be thought that really big dinosaurs, things like Diplodocus, Brachiosaurus, maybe were 100, 200 years old, based on looking at things like giant tortoises, how fast they grow. They were often used as a model, big crocodiles used as a model for how things these were. But when we actually slice the bones up, we can count how old these dinosaurs by counting the lines of arrested growth that they form each year in much the same way as a tree ring. Every year there is a pause in growth, you see a change in the bone histology, you can count up the rings that forms, and you can actually get a good estimation for how old that animal was at the time of its death. You can also decide if that animal was still growing, or actually if it was a fully grown adult using the same technique. And this is actually a growth curve for Tyrannosaurus rex. Now, I'm on public record already, but it's always worth saying, Tyrannosaurus rex is the most boring dinosaur of all time. It's completely overhyped, but what it does mean is there are lots of specimens of Tyrannosaurus. Lots of my colleagues who have they don't have the same level of taste and sophistication that I do, think that Tyrannosaurus is a fantastically exciting animal. So whenever something new comes along, whether it's a new methodology or a new technique, T-Rex is often used as a showcase or a primer for it. So it's actually, in one sense, it's quite useful because it stimulates a lot of work and it stimulates looking at a lot of other things. The fact that all meat-eating dinosaurs look the same is neither here nor there. But these things have been used, and as a result, again, this is a nice growth curve for Tyrannosaurus and a number of its relatives within the same group of Tyrannosauridae. And you can see these are fairly standard growth curves for an animal, which start off very quickly, have this kind of very quick phase, and then plateau out towards the top. It turns out that Tyrannosaurus probably maxed out as a reproductively mature adult, probably in its sort of early 20s. And in fact, none of the T-Rex specimens we know about, none of them is older than 33 years old. These are actually animals that, despite being up to 70 tons in weight, not T-Rex, but T-Rex got up to about 6.5 tons. These mammals actually reach full somatic size by the time they're about 18, 19 years old. So T-Rex teenager would have been a pretty unpleasant animal. It would have already been a fully working kind of eating machine. And these things went through a very rapid kind of growth phase to start with. So again, this is a very bird or mammal-like pattern. The other big thing that's been going on, obviously, in dinosaurs for the last few years, that's been reinvigorated in particular by finds from China, is the origin of birds. First suggested by Thomas Henry Huxley, really seriously, back in 1867, an idea that went out of fashion for good reasons in the early part of the 20th century, and then started to come back into vogue with a number of seminal papers in the 1970s, but nevertheless argued about by quite a lot of people, until more recently when there has been a huge amount of new data on the very small steps in between dinosaurs and birds. So, central to that debate for a lot of this time has been Archaeopteryx. I apologise for this rather odd-looking Archaeopteryx. It's from a recent museum exhibition. The only good thing about this model is it made a noise, and the noise it made was accurate because it was based on our ear measurements. So, but this gives you an idea of what an early bird would have looked like, which is actually not that dissimilar now from what we know a lot of meat-eating dinosaurs that were feathered but that were not birds also look like. There is a really nice continuum between a number of small meat-eating dinosaurs and the earliest birds, to the extent that whenever you see a paper in Nature on the next thing that's something to do with bird origins, they're usually arguing over one or two characters. This is a story that is basically more or less agreed by a number of people. There are some people who still aren't convinced, although they're relatively small group these days. And also, generally, there aren't many alternatives among naysayers. They haven't yet come up with a particularly convincing alternative origin for birds other than from dinosaurs that doesn't involve a lot more imagination or a lot of appeal to missing evidence. So this is a story that's been looked at in a lot of different detail. We've done things like looking at the brain of Archaeopteryx. The brain of Archaeopteryx is in many ways intermediate between what you would expect in a living bird and a reptile. This is an animal that has what people have called a flight-ready brain. Although the brain is flight-ready in terms of having relatively well-developed optic lobes and so on, it looks like some of the other parts of the brain aren't that well-developed. It's particularly in terms of the bits that are to do with coordination between hand-eye movements. There's a part of the brain called the flocculus, which is often particularly associated with coordination between hand-eye coordination in birds. Archaeopteryx flocculus is tiny. Probably not a very gifted flyer. So something that probably can fly actively, but it's not doing any acrobatics, it's not doing any loop-the-loops or swerve or handbrake turns as it's going around trees. Something that is probably a fairly clumsy-looking flyer, maybe something like a pheasant today. So not particularly elegant in the air. But we also see a number of other features. Not only do we see the anatomy, lots of skeletal similarities between birds and dinosaurs, they won't go into, but some really interesting behavioural similarities. This is an animal called Khan. It's a type of dinosaur called an oviraptorosaur, and it's shown here sitting on a nest. And it's sitting on that nest in an incredibly avian-like posture. It actually sits on its nest of eggs. This is not an imaginative reconstruction. This is a reconstruction of actual fossils. It's not just one fossil of one of these things brooding its eggs. There are multiple examples of these animals that have been killed during sandstorms, that basically being overwhelmed by collapsing sand dunes in the areas where these animals lived, sitting on top of their eggs in a way that is consistent with brooding behaviour, which is kind of ironic because oviraptorids were named originally because it was thought they were eating the eggs, whereas it turns out they were brooding them. And the conclusive proof of that came when they looked inside these eggs and actually found they had baby oviraptorosaurs in them. So these probably actually are doing very bird-like things. It even comes down to some of the minutiae of these kinds of behaviours. This is another tiny dinosaur, this thing called Mai from China. And Mai literally fits in the palm of my hand. It's a tiny, tiny dinosaur that's quite close to bird ancestry, but it's not yet a bird. And this is actually an adult dinosaur. And what you can see here is a bit mushed up, but this is an animal that's actually curved around on itself, with its head underneath its arm, its head tucked around itself, its tail tucked around the body. This is interpreted as a dinosaur that died while it was asleep, in a bird-like sleeping manner. Generally, only birds sleep with their heads tucked under their arms in a very stereotyped way like this. And it's suggested that even this behaviour, the origin of how birds sleep, which is quite esoteric really, can actually be traced back to some of the non-dinosaur ancestors of birds. But obviously the big thing, the big take-home story has been feathers. And now we have something like 24 species of dinosaurs that are known to have had coverings of some kind of feathers or fuzz. This is meant to be homologous with true feathers, so made of beta-keratin, the same kinds of stuff that feathers are made of today. Some of the geochemistry that has been done supports that, and we basically see, as we go from animals that are more classically meat-eating dinosaur-like through this transition into birds, that feather evolution follows the same path. The more primitive ones have basically bristle-like coatings, very simple down-like coatings. Then we go through a variety of evolutionary grades, if you like, through feathers that first develop shafts, then barbs, and then barbules in some of these cases. And these are all in animals that don't fly. These are all animals that still firmly anchored to the ground. They don't have the chest muscles for flying. They still have the build of a predatory dinosaur, but they're covered in this rather flamboyant coat instead. And the ideas for the origin of feathers, which for many years were tied up with thinking about bird origins and just birds in particular, which were all thought to be due to be advantageous for flight, they appear so early in the evolutionary lineage of birds, there's no way these things were going to be used for flight. Instead, it's much more likely they're used for display, for thermoregulation, or possibly for brooding behaviour. My own favourite, but it is just a favourite, I don't have a good reason for it being a favourite, is that it's probably display. Dinosaurs in general grow all sorts of weird things, horns and frills, and they have lots of structures that are very showy. I think this is another way that dinosaurs show off. And one way of doing that is by extending your body with lots of strange things that you can wave and shake at them. And also some of these dinosaurs actually have things like tail fans, which have no conceivable use in a terrestrial animal in an aerodynamic sense. It's probably there for showing off. So I suspect display is probably one thing, maybe working in conjunction with something to do with their thermal biology, because these are small animals, and maybe brooding. But this is a story that's now very well cemented. Lots of different animals, mainly from one set of deposits in China, but now also being found in other places. Some examples also now coming out of older deposits in Germany, and also for some other different types of dinosaur in other parts of the world. So it's a story where there's more and more evidence coming to light. And some of the most exciting work recently has actually been relating to feathers also, and that is to do with fossil colour. Now generally, up until a couple of years ago, if anyone asked me in a talk, how do I know why is a dinosaur that colour, I would shrug my shoulders and say, well, it looks kind of nice like that, doesn't it? It's, basically, the only way we would reconstruct colour in these animals is by looking at extant analogues. So big animals like elephants and rhinos and hippos are boring colours, they're solidly coloured. So we would reconstruct sauropods as big and boring and grey or dark brown or something like that. Whereas smaller animals tend to be a bit more brightly coloured or to have disruptive coloration for camouflage and so on. So people's imaginations would run a bit wilder with small dinosaurs. I remember in one of my, David Norman, who's my PhD supervisor, wrote a book in the mid-80s, and it became notorious among some people for having these lurid turquoise dinosaurs kind of scooting about. But to be honest, for all we know, they were polka dot pink and sort of lime green, and we didn't really have any direct evidence other than analogy with living animals. But in the last couple of years, it's been suggested that we can actually use chemical fossils and also ultrastructure from these fossils to actually predict colour in these animals. And for some of the Chinese dinosaurs, they've been looked at in immense detail. The feather structures have been put under high-powered scanning electron microscopes, and subcellular structures have been preserved in those fossils, which reveal some aspects of colour, in particular the organelles called melanosomes, which are the organelles that house the pigment within the cell, in particular melanin. It doesn't account for things like blues, which are a structural colour, but melanin does tell you something about if you're brown, russet, black. And it also can tell you if there isn't any, that it's probably white. So you can get a limited palette from this technique, and lo and behold, they did actually successfully get some of these results out. So these are two dinosaurs that have now been reconstructed with what are thought to be, at least in part, their original colours. These both feathered dinosaurs from China. The one on your right is called Sinosauropteryx, which is quite a primitive dinosaur, and that's been reconstructed as a ginger dinosaur. And that goes down really well with a certain proportion of the audience. The first dinosaur with colour was actually a ginger dinosaur with a white stripy tail. And the stripes on the tail, again, do seem genuine. They reflect areas where you don't get preservation of these melanosomes. So this seems to be, at least in general, sort of rusty coloured animal with white stripes going along it. Whereas the other animal on your left is a thing called Anchiornis. It looks like a bird. It's actually not a bird. I'm guessing that the artist decided that something had booted this out of a tree and it was a bit alarmed as it went. But this is actually very close to bird ancestry, but not a bird. But all that they could find in this animal were lots of melanosomes with the characteristic shape of black pigment. So this animal seems to have been black. There's some suggestion that it may have had a reddish head crest, and there's some suggestion of white bits scattered around the rest of the plumage. So a number of my colleagues are looking at this. There's a lot of argument about how valid this technique is, how it might have been affected by the geological processes that have affected these fossils as they've been preserved. But there's now some backup evidence in terms of actually looking at the chemical fossils themselves from these rocks and actually finding evidence of the original pigments themselves preserved with these fossils, which is where it's only just starting to be published. But it's actually generally backing up these kinds of ideas, at least in terms of Anchiornis being this kind of black and white bird. So for the first time, we're actually getting a real idea of what these animals look like. The last bit of dinosaurs I want to touch on very quickly is actually thinking about dinosaur evolution. Dinosaurs were around a long time. They interacted with lots of other organisms. They lived everywhere. They interacted not only with other dinosaurs, they interacted with the other animals that were living around them, and also, crucially, the plants. And one of the big areas of my research group's work has been trying to look at some of the macroecology and some of the bigger macroevolutionary questions that dinosaurs pose. So given that dinosaurs were such voracious herbivores, it's estimated that Brachiosaurus would probably be needing to eat something like 100 kilograms of fodder per day just to keep going. These things may well have been having quite substantial impacts on the floras that lived alongside them, and that raises a kind of number of interesting questions about how plants responded to that level of dinosaur herbivory. Do we have any plant defences coming in that are specifically there to put dinosaurs off? Do certain types of plants go extinct because of dinosaurs? Do other sorts of plants, in particular flowering plants, do they develop as a response to being heavily cropped by dinosaurs? So this is an issue that I've actually been quite interested in since my PhD, which has been trying to integrate what we know about the actual feeding of these animals, looking at the teeth, jaws, modelling how they work, thinking about the ecology of these animals, which ranges from how big they are, which levels they're browsing at, the sorts of plants they might have eaten, and combining that with a view of the plant record to see if there really are any big coincidences between what the plants are doing and what the dinosaurs are doing. So, as it turns out, we've been doing a number of analyses looking at the distribution of different dinosaur and plant groups through time. So this is a map of the world in the latest Cretaceous period. All of the dots you can see are either dinosaur occurrences or they're occurrences of major potential dinosaur food plants, in this case flowering plants or angiosperms. And we've used maps like this through time for each interval of time through the Mesozoic where we have information on dinosaurs and plants. Use this technique. This is a geographical information system plot of this kind of information to then make statistical tests of whether the distributions of these animals actually change in concert through time. If they really are affecting each other, we would expect to see those changes occurring in concert. If they're not really affecting each other, those changes are effectively going to be random. As it turns out, rather disappointingly, all of those changes are random. So I would actually argue that although dinosaurs are probably quite important if you're a plant, you wouldn't want to have been eaten or trodden on by a dinosaur, it's probably not, at least on the basis of what we can actually tell at the moment, a major driver of dinosaur evolution. It's a shame, it's a really elegant idea. I really love the idea that dinosaurs invented flowers, which was actually the name of the Nature paper that suggested that back in the late 70s. I really love the idea that dinosaurs were responsible for actually flowering plants getting going. And who's to say that on a more local level that they weren't doing something? I would firmly expect some more local co-evolutionary interactions to be going on between dinosaurs and plants on a more specific basis. But in terms of the origin of this major group, dinosaurs might not have had much of a say. Similarly, it's also suggested that the decline of some dinosaurs led to the relative decline of cycads during the Cretaceous. But again, unfortunately, when you actually look at the numbers, there's no real evidence for driving it. Again, it's nice from a vertebrate paleontology point of view, where we have relatively few fossils and relatively small numbers of taxa to deal with. It would be nice to think we were affecting another kingdom in terms of what it was up to, but in this case, unfortunately, it looks like the evidence so far is fairly negative in terms of what they were doing. But dinosaurs doing other odd things as well. Most of you will be familiar with something called the latitudinal biodiversity gradient, which is a great way of saying that most species diversity today is concentrated around the equator. Most of the animals and plants that we know about today, most of their diversity, particularly for marine animals, lies within 30 degrees of the equator. And as we go towards the poles, there are fewer animals and plants. There are lots of reasons suggested for that. No one really understands why that's the case today. It's been suggested it's to do with the relative amount of energy arriving at the poles versus at the equator, although ironically a lot of the productivity at the equator is actually quite a lot less than going on at the poles. But nevertheless, it seems to be a consistent pattern for most major groups of animals and plants today. So we thought it would be fun to see if this was the same with dinosaurs. And it turns out that dinosaurs are doing something different. Dinosaurs don't have their greatest diversity at the equator. In fact, their greatest diversity is in the mid-latitudes. But we thought that might be because that's where most people collect dinosaurs. So we then went back to our analyses, took that out, and it turns out that actually what's controlling dinosaur distribution is not how we collect dinosaurs, not dinosaur body size, not where they occur geographically. It's actually land area, and it's because the Earth looked different 65 million years ago. Most of the land, instead of being concentrated in the way it is today, was actually concentrated in a rather different way. And we found that if you can predict where land area is in the Mesozoic, you can predict where most dinosaurs will be found. Which sounds like a bit of a no-brainer, but that actually has a knock-on consequence for how we understand the modern-day latitudinal biodiversity gradient. Other people have done this work with fossil insects. They don't find this great diversity of things at the equator back in time. Instead, they only find that comes later in geological time. It actually looks like this big macroecological pattern that everyone accepts must be true and must have been true forever, probably wasn't true forever, and it's probably a relatively modern phenomenon. The interesting thing now becomes, when did it come in? So it looks like there should be quite a lot of interesting work to do on things, particularly between about 66 million years ago when dinosaurs go and about 20 or 30 million years ago. Really, what's going on? Do we still see that modern pattern? When does the modern pattern actually kick in? The only place it holds is in the sea. The sea, we still see that same pattern going on way back into the ancient geological past. But on land, something different is going on. So there's something different going on in terms of the history. There's also something different going on between land and sea, which was not realised until actually the paleontologists went back and looked at the fossil record and said, actually, we've all been told that this is the case, but it's not, at least not in the deep past. So we can make still a bigger contribution. But obviously, most of our stuff still comes about through finding things, going out, finding new animals. 30 years ago, we wouldn't have thought that one of the most bizarre dinosaurs ever found would have been found in a brick pit in Surrey, not very far from where we're sitting at the moment. There are lots of animals that are still coming out, 50 to 60 a year, that are keeping us on our toes and also giving us lots of ideas about how these animals might have lived and how they might have died. So with that, I'll just leave you with that thought, and thank you for your attention.